Well, hello there. I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile, Halloween edition. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. I'm Leah. If you're not new here, welcome back. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. Today's book isn't really a book. It is a short story out of the complete collection of Edgar Allen Poe, and it is titled The Telltale Heart. And I am wearing, hold on, and I am wearing an appropriate t-shirt. It's spooky season, so The Telltale Heart is quite a terrifying story, especially when you read it for yourself and turn out all the lights and get spooky. It's so fun. But if you're thinking about reading this for yourself and you don't want to know anything about it, then don't watch this video. This is not the video for you. If you don't want to read the story, but you want to know what happens in it, this is an excellent video for you. Or if you just want to hear my take on it, my interpretation of the story, and watch me do my makeup at the same time. Some spooky Halloween makeup. I mean, it's not like costume makeup, it's just cute Halloween colors makeup. Anyway, if all of that sounds fun to you, then stay tuned. All right, before we get started, if you are interested in any of the products that I'm using, they will be listed in the description box below because we don't talk about that part here. Also, just so you know, I really hate my hair today. It's everything I have to not pull a Britney. So, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allen Poe. And this was first published in 1843. Now, the narrator starts out by asking us, but why would you say I'm mad? Sure, I'm a little nervous, but my disease has sharpened my senses, not destroyed them or even dulled them. My sense of hearing is acute. I heard all things in heaven and on earth, and many things in hell, too. How could you say I'm mad? I'll prove that I'm not mad by telling you the whole story healthfully and calmly. And he says he can't really remember how he first came up with the idea, but once he did, he could not get it out of his mind. It haunted him day and night. And he never attempted to talk himself out of the idea. After all, he loved the old man. He had never wronged him or insulted him, and he had no desire for his money. But he says, I think it was his eye. Yes, I'm sure of it. One of his eyes resembled a vulture's, a pale blue eye with a film over it. And whenever he looked at it, his blood ran cold. And gradually, over time, he made up his mind to take the life of the old man and rid himself of that eye forever. Then he says to the reader, so you think I'm mad, huh? Well, you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely and cautiously and with foresight I proceeded with my plan. He says that he was super kind to the old man during the week leading up to his killing. He said that every night about midnight, he would turn the latch of the old man's bedroom door and open it. He said that oh so gently he would make an opening big enough for his head to fit through. And he would put a dark lantern through the opening that shone no light. Then he would put his head through the opening, and oh so cunningly and slowly, because he didn't want to wake the old man. He would move his head in so slowly that it took an hour to fit his whole head through, so that he could see the old man lying in bed. He says, I mean, would a madman have been able to be so wise as this? Then, with his head and the lantern all the way through the opening of the door, he would oh so cautiously undo the little door on the lantern. He had to be very cautious because the hinges on it creaked, and he would turn it on just enough so just one single ray of light would shine onto the vulture eye. Now he did this every single night for 7 nights at midnight. But since the old man was sleeping, his eyes were closed and you couldn't see the vulture eye. And so the narrator didn't feel the need to go through with his plans, because it wasn't the old man that vexed him, but his evil eye. And without seeing the eye, he felt no need to follow through with his plan. And then every morning he would go into the old man's room and speak very kindly to him as he helped him get up. He would ask him how he slept. So there was no way that the old man suspected that every evening at midnight he came in and watched him sleep. Now, on the 8th night, he was more cautious than usual when opening the door. He moved slower than the minute hand on a watch. And for some reason, on this night, more than any other night, he felt the extent of his own powers. And he could hardly contain his feelings of triumph. I mean, to think for 7 nights in a row he's been able to do this, and the old man didn't suspect a thing, not even that he had dreamed like he had come into his room. Now he chuckled to himself at this idea, and perhaps the old man had heard him, because he suddenly shifted in his bed like something had startled him. And then the narrator says, you know, you probably think that I suddenly drew back, but I didn't. The room was black as tar because the shutters were drawn for fear of robbers. So he knew the old man hadn't seen him, and he knew that he couldn't see the opening in the door, so he very slowly kept pushing on it. Now, once he had his head and the lantern all the way through the opening and was about to turn on the lantern, his thumb slipped on the tin fastening, and all of a sudden the old man sat up in bed and he shouted, "Who's there?" Now, he kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour he did not move a muscle, and neither did the old man. He stayed sitting up in bed and listening, just as our narrator had, night after night, listening to the death clock on the wall. Then he heard the slight groan come from the old man, and he knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It wasn't the kind of groan when you're in pain or in grief. It was the slow, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul. Now, our narrator knew the sound well, because he had heard it many times well up from his own soul. He knew that what the old man felt, and he pitied him. But still he chuckled to himself. He knew that the old man had been awake ever since that first slight noise when he turned in the bed. He knew his fears had been growing ever since, and he knew he had been trying to get it out of his mind, but couldn't. He knew that the old man was saying to himself that it was nothing but the wind or a mouse. He knew that the old man had been trying to comfort himself with these superstitions, but he found it all in vain. And he also knew that the old man still did not feel his presence of his head looking through the door. Now, when a long time had gone by and he still hadn't heard the old man lie down, he decided to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern, and he turned it on stealthily until a single ray of light, like the thread of a spider, shot from the lantern and right onto the vulture eye. And it was open, wide open. And he grew furious when he saw it. And he saw it with perfect distinctness, all dull blue with a veil over it. And it chilled the marrow of his bones. And he could see nothing else of the old man's face or body, because the light was directly, precisely on that damned eye. Then he says to the reader, "Now I have told you that what you mistake as madness is but acuteness of the senses." And he says that he began to hear the low, quick, dull sound, kind of like a watch wrapped in cotton. And he knew the sound all too well. It was the beating of the old man's heart. And it increased his fury, kind of like the steady beating drum stimulates the soldier. But he kept still. He could hardly breathe. He maintained the ray of light on the old man's eye. Meanwhile, the hellish sound of the heartbeat increased, and it grew quicker and quicker and louder and louder. The old man's terror must have been increasing as it grew louder and louder and louder. Then the narrator asks, "Do you mark me well?" He's like, "I told you I was nervous." Then, in the dead hour of the night, and in the dreadful silence of the old house, he felt an uncontrollable terror. He remained still for many minutes, but the beating grew louder and louder. He thought the old man's heart was going to burst. But then suddenly, he had a new anxiety seize him. Could the neighbors hear the sound of the beating heart? Since it was so loud, it was time for the old man's hour to come. And with a loud yell, the narrator turned the lantern on all the way and then leaped into the room. And the old man shrieked once, and in an instant the narrator dragged him to the floor, and it says that he pulled the heavy bed over him. Now, I'm not sure if he's talking about the mattress or the bedding, but I think he's somehow smothering him. Then a smile came across the narrator's face, because he knew the deed was done. But for many minutes he could still hear the old man's heart beating. But it didn't worry him. He knew there was no way the neighbors could hear this. And finally it stopped, and the old man was dead. He removed the bedding from him and examined the corpse, and he was stone dead. He put his hand on his heart and left it there for many minutes, but he could feel no pulse, and the old man's eye would trouble him no more. Then he says to the reader, "If you still think I'm mad, you won't after hearing how I so wisely took precautions to conceal the body." He worked quickly but silently. First, he dismembered the corpse. He cut off the head and the arms and the legs. Then he pulled up 3 planks from the flooring, and he put all the parts between the scatlings. He replaced the boards so cunningly that you couldn't detect that anything had ever been disturbed. And there was nothing to wash away, no stains, no blood spots. He says that I had been too tired for that. A tub caught all of that. Ha ha ha. And when he was all finished, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and It was still dark as midnight, and the clock chimed the top of the hour. Right at the same time, there was a knock at the front door. So he goes down to open it with a light heart, because what did he have to fear? There were 3 police officers standing there. A shriek had been reported in the middle of the night by the neighbors, and there was a suspicion of foul play. So the police had been sent there to search the premises. And he smiled at them, for what did he have to fear? He welcomed them inside and told them that the shriek had been him just having a dream, and that the old man that lived there was just out of town, out in the country. He took the police all over the house, and he even took them to the old man's bedroom to show them that everything was fine and undisturbed. Then he pulled up some chairs for the officers and told them to take a load off. And then he pulled up a chair for himself, right over the very spot that held the corpse of his victim. And the officers seemed very satisfied with their search because his manner had been so convincing. He was at ease. They sat there and he answered their questions cheerfully, and they made small talk and chatted. But after a little bit, he felt himself growing pale and wished that they would leave already. He started to get a headache and he had a ringing in his ears. But still he sat there and kept chatting. The ringing became more and more distinct, but he talked more to try and get rid of that feeling. But it continued to grow until finally he realized that the noise was not coming from within his ears. And he felt himself growing paler and paler, and so talked faster with a heightened voice to make sure like he seemed like he was fine. But the sound increased, and what could he do? It was the sound like a low, dull, quick sound, much like the sound of a watch wrapped in cotton. He gasps, but the officers didn't seem to notice, and he began to talk more quickly and loudly, and the noise steadily increased. And he stood up, continuing to talk with the officers, but his voice was in a higher key, and he was using violent gestures. The noise still increased. He was like, why won't they leave? And he started pacing the floor with heavy strides, thinking his footsteps would mask the sound. But the noise increased. He's like, oh God, what am I gonna do? And he's thinking, there is no way that they can't hear this. And in his mind, he's like getting really worked up, and he's starting to swear and rage. And he began to nonchalantly kind of move his chair around so that it grated on the boards, again to try and mask the sound that was continuing to increase. And it grew louder and louder and louder, and still the men just kept chatting pleasantly and smiling. And then he thinks, is it possible that they can't hear it? And he's like, no way, they can hear it. They suspect, they know, they're just making a mockery of my horror, he thinks. But anything was better than this agony, and anything was more tolerable than their mocking. He could bear their hypocritical smiles no longer. He felt like he had to scream out or die. And finally, he just yells out, villains! He's like, I admit it, I did it. He's like, pull up the planks. It is the beating of his hideous heart. The end. Now, pretty terrifying story. Now I think the beating of the heart that he's hearing coming from under the floor, obviously, I'm pretty sure it's obvious. It's his own heart beating out of, you know, anxiety. So I think the lesson is a couple of things here. One, doing bad things can drive you mad. Also, mad people don't usually know they're mad. I mean, the story starts out, he's like, I know you think I'm mad, but he doesn't think he is. He thinks he's wonderful, obviously, which also points to the fact that I think he has what I think is called megalomania, which is the delusion of self-importance, and also monomania, which is the fixation on one object. So the guy's eye, he just like is fixated on it. So yeah, that is the story of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. I definitely, for next spooky season, want to do a couple more of these. Some of his maybe less famous poems and stories. They're just so good. Ugh. Anyways, if you are thinking about reading this story for yourself, I would highly encourage that, because again, my summaries do them no justice. So I will link the book that I got this story out of in the description box. And if there are any stories that you would like me to cover, let me know in the comments. Spooky season's about over, but if you have anything Christmassy, that would be fun. Remember, doing bad things can drive you mad. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. So, So he goes down to the